So then everything changes. So again, hominins by and large were foragers for much of the history of hominins, and then you have the Neolithic Revolution. So as far as we can tell, and some of these things are not perfectly able to tell, but as far as we can tell, humans began hijacking evolution about 10,000 years ago. Now what do I mean by hijacking evolution? Look at this corn. Corn, wonderful corn. We make it into corn syrup, we make it into creamed corn, we make it into corn on the cob, we feed it to our livestock and then eat the livestock. We do all sorts of things with corn, or maize as it's sometimes called. However, corn was not always corn, as you might imagine. Corn previously looked more like this, these kind of very small kernels, and before that it actually looked like this, tassodi grasses, which are just really small and just tiny little kernels, compared to this absurd delight of food. So that happened as these plants were cultivated over time as people selected for them to be larger, aka they would have probably picked the seeds from the largest plants and then planted those so that you could keep getting the largest plants each generation, and gotten the plants larger and larger and more productive with each generation. Fast forward a couple thousand years and you have modern corn. This potentially happened accidentally for the first little bit, but then pretty soon humans caught on to what they were doing by modifying the plant, by planting its seeds in the ground, and figured out how to control the process, and you have domestication of corn in Mexico. A plant that has, of course, revolutionized the world. You have similar processes going on around the world from about 10,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, and they happen in several places as apparently independently of each other, which is fascinating. So in Mesoamerica, Central America, in Eastern Africa, where you have the domestication of millet and sorghum, in Mesopotamia, where you have the domestication of wheat, holy crap, wheat, right? Wheat's in everything, and barley, where you have the domestication of rice in East Asia, where you have the domestication of what is it in Peru? Potatoes? Potatoes. All these things getting domesticated, all these plants. So animals was big. It was big when we got dogs and cats. Dogs and cats are great. But plants, now that changes everything. This is also around the time period that we start domesticating animals, not just to be our pets, but to be our food. So that's a bit of a disturbing thought if you think about it. We domesticated them first for pets and then started domesticating them for food. But this is around the time that we, for example, take cows and make them into cows. Cows were not always cows. Cows started out, as far as we can tell, from a being called an auroch. So an auroch is kind of like a cow, except for it's like leaner. It doesn't exist anymore, which is why I can't just like show you a great picture of an auroch. They do have some fossils and things, but basically it's like a leaner cow with like huge horns. It's pretty awesome. We domesticated that to basically make it fatter and yummier and more docile. And we did that with a number of different things like goats and sheep. Generally speaking, humans selected animals that already existed in herds because that allowed us to insert ourselves into hierarchies, right? Herd animals can be herded, so long as you can figure out how to control them. So domestication started of animals at this time, and then domestication of plants both started around the same time period. The shaping of food to make it more productive. So you take the natural processes of evolution, which favor, among other things, the ability to spread one's genes, and then you say, basically, we start artificial selection, by which I mean humans start saying, whoa, hold back, nature. I know that this little scrubby grass is the best thing as far as to spread its genes, but what's best for humans is a yummy, yummy plant that makes huge gold kernels. And don't worry about spreading the genes, because we'll take care of that by planting it. And that's basically what domestication is. Humans hijacking evolution. So I've got one of those Drake memes here, and it's got up here is having to leave my village to find healthy food, making a bunch of unhealthy food grow in my village. So I already kind of mentioned this point, but the initial shift to food production is often associated actually with some health disadvantages in the fossil record, but then over time the diet diversifies more. There's more medicine, and groups adapt, and you eventually get health benefits, and eventually huge health benefits. So what happens from the shift to food production is, well, maybe this isn't a health benefit so much as a population increase benefit. When you shift over to food production, you create a surplus. When you create a surplus, i.e. when there's more food than you know what to do with, people are very well fed. When people are very well fed, generally speaking, they are healthier. Well, again, we've talked about the fact that not necessarily depending on what they're eating, but they are potentially healthier. They're typically more reproductively fertile. And as a result, eventually, and they're also able to better provide for groups of the member who may not be doing as well food-wise. So eventually you have a situation where you have a surplus of food, so it accelerates the population growth because people just are able to provide more in that way, and a larger surplus. And so you have a rapid increase in human population that happens right around the time that there's the shift to food production. Now, again, these trends aren't universal, right? You have groups like the Calusa, for example, in pre-colonial Florida, where you have like large, very, very large societies that were hunter-gatherer groups. So it's not always the case that an agricultural group's population is going to grow faster. But it's often the case, and it's certainly the case with historically, that once humans started getting into the domestication process, that's when the human population started to trick up, until eventually you get to the exponential population growth that we have nowadays. So with domestication, humans shift from hunting and gathering, from food collection, from going out and getting what's available, to food production, to saying, all right, nature, do our will. All right, time to start producing food the way we want you to. This is another kind of some other examples of food, of domestication, wild wheat versus what wheat later looks like. Again, hijacking evolution. And this just shows some of the different places it happens. When we tell the story of the rise of civilization, quote unquote, and the rise of agriculture and all this, we oftentimes, at least the way I was taught, and maybe it's because I was, taught 20 years ago or so, but we're taught about it like all starting here in the Fertile Crescent, the Middle East. That's a kind of Eurocentric viewpoint in the sense that that's certainly the rise of agriculture that then influenced Europe, but there's actually several different places around the same time period where agriculture gets developed. Yams get domesticated here in Papua New Guinea, rice over here, pearl millet over here, and African rice, probably peanuts and chili peppers here, potatoes and quinoa, squash. So we really have, I think about half of the 10 most globally eaten domesticates actually come from the New World, quote unquote, the Americas, rather than having anything to do with the Fertile Crescent or even East Asia. So you have it arising several places simultaneously, or within about 5,000 years of each other. Now, 5,000 years may seem like a long time period. From a geologic, anthropological standpoint, it's not. So the question you have to ask yourself, if this happened all over the world about 10 to 5,000 years ago, is what the heck was going on about 10 to 5,000 years ago? The answer, we're trying to figure it out still. We don't have a time machine. Constant problem for us as anthropologists. But as far as we can tell from reconstructions of what the climate was doing, and we have certain ways of getting at that, such as studying tree rings, among other things, and studying soil deposits in the ground, as well as studying over a macro scale how the atmosphere has changed. When we look at environmental changes over time, what we seem to see is that about 10 to 5,000 years ago, especially about kind of 12 to 8,000 years ago, you had this shift where things got really dry and not as hospitable for humans in this whole region. So it wasn't like a super great time for humans for hunting and gathering as things get drier, more arid, and it's more difficult to do hunting and gathering. The environments are becoming less productive in these areas. So people in these areas are going to start trying to think of alternatives. That's what human beings do. We're creative. We have culture. We try to think of alternatives. And you have to think we've been through at this point hundreds of thousands of years of better and better tool development. We're at a more creative language development. Humans 10,000 years ago are in a sense kind of at a better place than they've ever been in terms of ability to invent new ways of doing things. And suddenly you have this time period where a whole lot of cultures around the world are going through environmental stress, where it starts to become harder to provide. And so I want you to think about the fact that when a society is under stress, that causes unique adaptations. And modern society is no exception to that. So people in my generation, quote millennials, went through a gigantic recession previous to the current one, of course. And as a result, a lot of people started getting into forms of labor that we sometimes call side hustles, right? People started kind of like selling things online and stuff like that, or blogging to make some side money. And then that has become now actually a pretty large portion of the economy. So sometimes times of unique economic stress or resource stress cause societies to kind of like mix and match with things and come up with new ways of doing things. And then suddenly that becomes the new norm. And that seems to be what happened during the Neolithic Revolution, is that under time of intense environmental stress, several societies went from sort of slight alteration of their environment to suddenly like intentionally altering the environment and trying to experiment with breeding plants and selecting plants and making plants bigger and better for human beings and controlling where they grew and getting them to grow closer to their village, try to make life a little easier on themselves during a stressful time. That led to the domestication of crops, and then that led to a huge population growth as a result of the surplus, which then kind of becomes a runaway train, because once you have huge population growth, now you go from farming being like, well, this was helpful while we were going through a stressful time when hunting was hard, to, well, now we have to farm, right? Because suddenly you have 1,000 people where there used to be 100 people, and the 1,000 people cannot survive on the amount of meat that is being produced by wild animals in that environment. So suddenly you're stuck with agriculture, so to speak, which, if you think about it, is sort of the situation for much of the industrialized world today. It would not really be possible to go back to full hunting and gathering for most of the industrialized world today. The population is simply too high to support it. So agriculture and herding and things like that sort of becomes a runaway train after about 5,000 years ago, where certain groups here become agricultural and never turn back. And, that's major. And a lot of these are places you'll notice, not only geographically are they, a lot of them in kind of this band that was going through environmental stress, but also a lot of these are areas, there are exceptions, but a lot of these are areas where major empires arose. Chinese and Japanese and Korean empires, Middle Eastern empires, East African empires, and Central African empires, Mesoamerican and Northern Amazonian empires. You have the empires, different mound building and other empires in the eastern United States. You have groups that become very, very large and very, very city-based, and eventually have, huge territories that they're covering. So it's significant, right? Agriculture is directly connected to that. So that kind of says all of what I just said. By the way, there's other theories for why people started domesticating plants. I don't find them nearly as compelling, so I don't teach them as much. But here's two others that your book talked about, one of which is prestige goods. So the idea that people started growing plants as a way of basically like, that it was the yummy kinds of food that people wanted, like, yum, we love corn. So then they started domesticating corn, and then it became sort of something for elites to do, to throw big parties with the yummy domesticated food, and then it spread to the commoners, kind of like elite foods often spreads to the commoners, right? Wine and champagne start out as a fancy thing and then spreads to everybody. Maybe it's possible. I don't know that I super buy it. Another theory is that this actually all started with the human, so there's this other theory that kind of eventually leads to domestication, but the idea that human evolution was largely driven by the fact that we were able to eat fermented fruit, and then that led to more of our bipedalism. So that's actually not so much about why we started domesticating, just as why we evolved. It's basically when we started being able to make use of alcoholic plants. There's not a lot of evidence for that, other than it being kind of a fun theory. So in any case, once humans start using domesticated animals and plants, it's a runaway train. And you go from having one way of doing things, foraging, hunting, and gathering, to suddenly 5 subsistence strategies within a few thousand years. So suddenly you have pastoralism, horticulture, agriculture, and industrialism. And when I say subsistence strategy, what I mean by that is a way of making a living, a way of getting food and shelter. So suddenly you go from everybody being hunters and gatherers to a bunch of people going into this, or this. And I want to talk about what those are right as we get into the next